Nigel Gould-Davies has only just recently been on the channel, and actually, that got some of the strongest and most positive comments that actually the audience has given for a long time. So he is back. But specifically, we're going to be talking about a topic that's very close to my heart, one which I think is of supreme importance and has, dare I say it, caused a little bit of controversy with some recent articles, none of which I think is misplaced. But let's sort of go into the biography a little bit and then we'll dive into this incredibly important topic. Nigel is a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, in London. Between 2010 and 13, he held senior government relations roles in the international energy industry. Previously, he also served in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where his roles included head of the economic section in Moscow, ambassador to Belarus, and project director in the policy planning unit. He's also author of Tectonic Politics, Global Geopolitical Risk in an Age of Transformation. And goodness, is that relevant to where the world is heading now. Nigel, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Now, I'm not sure if stoking controversy was your purpose at all, but it certainly seems to have done that. Could you please give us a little bit of a background into the articles you've recently written, what motivated you to do that, why you thought it was important to bring these topics into the public and indeed the expert sphere?
Yeah, no, thank you. Originally, it was just a single article that I planned, a short piece, intending to offer some reflections on some of the positions that the Russian exiled opposition appear to have taken, I mean, very explicitly and publicly taken. And that seems to have sparked a larger debate. There's been responses to that, and I've responded in turn. And it's sort of worked up a kind of froth or certainly kind of interest that I didn't really anticipate or intend. But to go back to the origins of this, uh, looking at the stated positions over time of most of the major Russian opposition figures since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I was struck by what I would describe as a strategic sort of contradiction or inconsistency between, on the one hand, their stated goals, and on the other hand, the proposed means and policies that they were trying to lobby and influence Western governments to adopt in order to achieve those goals. Now, the goal that they all have in common is the removal or the end, the supplanting of the Putin regime. They don't call it this exactly, but regime change is what it amounts to. And in fact, the Berlin Declaration that many, but not all, of these senior opposition figures signed in 2023 refers specifically to the quote, liquidation of the regime. That's a radical goal. That goes beyond what European and other Western governments seek. On the other hand, if you look at the means that they propose, the policies that they advocate, they, in one way or another, it seems to me, are directed at restraint rather than radicalism. So they say, for example, we have to limit the sanctions we impose on Russia, only target senior individuals and not the wider economy. Second, they say, well, it's very important to ensure that when the war is over, Russia receives a sort of Marshall Plan, which implies significant financial help to Russia, the aggressor, to help it rebuild. And thirdly, they say, or many of them say, that Europe should open itself up now to much larger scale immigration of Russian experts, engineers, technical specialists. They say that will drain Russia of expertise and conversely help Europe build up its capabilities. I think there are problems with all of those proposals. And if one asks why, what motivates these strangely inconsistent arguments, it seemed that to me that they were dominated by a wish to, if not curry favor, then at least to try to seek the approval of large number of ordinary Russian people. And I can understand that, but I just don't see how restraining our policies towards Russia can possibly achieve the goals that either the opposition or we in Europe wish.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because someone like Ilya Ponomarov, who's out on the sort of more extreme end, I would say, of wanting to erase the Russian regime and talks about the need for punitive sanctions. Indeed, Kasparov is in a similar kind of place. I won't group them together in terms of suggest they're collaborating. It's complicated, but certainly they're on that extreme end proposing sanctions. They essentially state that there is no concept of independent entities in Russia. There is no oligarchs are not independent of the state and its objectives. Therefore, you cannot divide the people from the state. You cannot say here you have, this elite that is behind the war. It is a system. It's almost sort of hermetically, I'm going to say sealed, but it is part of an entire apparatus.
Yes, that's very much the case. And as Russia, as the regime, draws on a steadily growing proportion of the resources, material and human, of the state and of the country in order to wage its terrible war in Ukraine, I think the conclusion is inescapable that the sinews of this aggressive power lie in the economy and the society. I think that's inescapable. So, to express this contradiction that I identified in another way, you can't possibly hope to uh, get rid of the regime or even end the war unless you fundamentally constrain its access to the resources that are sustaining its power and sustaining its war. That may be an unpalatable conclusion to some, but good strategy is all about seeing clearly. And I'm glad you made the distinction among some of the opposition figures because we can't treat them as a single group. They have a diversity of views among them. One might even say that one of the characteristic weaknesses of the Russian opposition in the present and the past is its tendency to fight with one another. But there are some individuals that do seem to see these things more clearly. And I would single out people like Garry Kasparov for this reason. Also, Boris Nemtsov, I think, had a very clear, strategically far-sighted understanding of what was needed to constrain this regime. It was even before the full-scale invasion. Of course, he was gunned down in 2015. And I think that's important because it's not just me or people like me as non-Russian outsiders who are making this argument. There are some, too few, but some, I think, important Russian figures doing so themselves.
And I want to go back to one of these points here because we had certainly Ilya Yashin, Karamazov, especially immediately after their release, directly calling, as you say, for sanctions to be only targeted at key regime individuals. One of the challenges with this, of course, and it's been pointed out very clearly again by Kasparov, Ponomarov, and several others, and of course many Ukrainian commentators, is the immediate result of narrowing sanctions and indeed the result of the, dare I say it, very leaky sanctions regime the West pats itself on the back about, but actually is been somewhat ineffective. The immediate result of narrowing sanctions would be a scaling up in the slaughter of Ukrainians. There is a direct correlation between those things. Definitely, please comment on that. But also amongst some of the Russian opposition, there is an overt mention of Ukrainians when they are talking about also defeating, their own regime. Certainly, Khodorkovsky made a very effusive apology in the early part of the war, the first days of the war, to the Ukrainian people, where I think he genuinely was emotionally overwhelmed by it. And we had Kasparov and others saying the same thing, making a direct apology and making the case that they personally, despite their opposition activities, were culpable for that. We have not had that same, I would say, sort of emotive apology from others. Some will mention Ukraine, some will barely mention Ukrainians at all. Notably, Yulia Navalny. It's shocking the degree to which some of the opposition will not refer to Ukraine at all. So there's quite a lot of stuff in there. But could you comment first on the idea of narrow sanctions leading directly to the slaughter of Ukrainians, and then secondly, this other real problem there is amongst some, which as you say distinguishes some from the others, that they cannot credit Ukraine being as being their primary motive or even having agency in this process.
Yeah, there's much to say about sanctions, and you and I have discussed sanctions in the past, but very briefly, they are an essential tool of constraining Russia. Not the only one, but they are genuinely significant and important and escalating. And a measure of their efficacy is the fact that the Kremlin clearly hates them. And indeed, Putin has repeatedly set the lifting of sanctions as a condition for any potential future peace. These are profoundly unwelcome, and they are not completely, but in important ways, depriving or constraining the Russian war machine's access to the means of destruction. It inevitably follows from that that any easing or lifting of the sanctions, any attempt to target only particular individuals rather than entire sectors or the system as a whole, will, exactly as you say, make it easier for Russia, for the war machine to acquire the material that it needs. It literally makes, if you're against the war, you have to be for sanctions. It really is as simple as that. And yet you have this peculiar argument that, oh, sanctions hurt ordinary Russian people. We shouldn't hurt them. Therefore, we shouldn't have sanctions. Well, the war is hurting, and the 1.3 million Russian citizens killed and wounded as a consequence of this war have done vastly greater damage to Russia and Russian society than our sanctions. So I would say it best serves the interests of ordinary Russian people to bring this war to an end as quickly as possible. The best way to do that is to make it impossible for Russia to fight this war, and sanctions are an indispensable contribution to that. So, in all of this, my observation is that there is a lack of strategic clarity and thinking through the consequences of stated positions on the part of many senior members of the Russian opposition. To be clear, I'm not accusing them of any kind of malign and underhand motive. And particularly in my second article in the Moscow Times, I made very, very clear that these are people who have suffered grievously under this terrible regime. I admire their bravery. They've made difficult and life-changing decisions to leave their country. That's a difficult thing to do. I salute that. What I'm asking is that they think clearly and in a fully logical and unflinching way about what is necessary to end the war. We can make this point about other proposals as well, and I will mention in particular the proposal, and you mentioned Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and it's something that he himself has particularly emphasized since soon after the full-scale invasion. He said, liberalize large-scale Russian immigration into Europe, drain the system of expertise. That might superficially make sense, but think what that means in practice. It means Europe saying, okay, you Russians who have chosen to live in the country for over 4 years of war, some of whom may have actually aided and abetted the war machine, now you can come and it's safe for us to admit you. We know, because there are recent examples of this already, that some of those who have come to Europe have, shall we say, been working for a second salary. They have connections with the Russian intelligence services. Not all, of course, not most, of course. But it only takes a small number of such people to get into the right positions within Europe to cause a great deal of damage and be able to escalate the campaign of sabotage and disruption and technological theft and even assassinations that we know the intelligence services are ramping up. That will put an intolerable strain on our counterintelligence services that are already stressed. And I find it genuinely puzzling that people who have suffered under this regime and know something of its malevolence should underplay and even dismiss the real risks of penetration of our societies in this way.
It speaks to, I mean, this is my personal view, it speaks to a certain sense of privilege, um, which can't possibly, accept the idea that they individually are also culpable for what's going on, or not even culpable, that there's some kind of sense of shared responsibility, that if you were to claim the ethnicity or a link to the sort of culture and identity of a certain country, somehow you can absolve yourself entirely from the political aspects of it. But I mean, that's a human thing, but it is a particularly Russian thing, I think, to want to assert that. And now, Ukrainians, don't have any, let's say, skin in the game here in Russia, nor do they want to. They look upon, I think, the Russian opposition, even when they're well-meaning, as being particularly ineffective. So let's turn to that idea. You've talked about the methodologies and the means of regime change, which many of them say they support. What are those methods and means that you've logged, that they sort of purport to hold or trying to implement? And how far do they fall from what is necessary to tackle a regime that is as toxic, as well embedded in that society and its resources as perhaps any dictatorship in history?
Yes, I mean, we all have to acknowledge that trying to sort of challenge or undermine this regime is exceptionally difficult. It is a regime that was repressive enough in February 2022, but has become steadily, indeed dramatically more so ever since. Every few months, particularly if you look at the series of forms and instruments of domestic electronic surveillance, there's an extraordinary sort of escalation in control now and monitoring and surveillance. So this is not easy. Uh, but I return to this point that the goal that European and Western states have set themselves is not to change the regime. This is a, a goal that the Russian opposition has set itself. It's in that respect more radical, which makes it, again, surprising and puzzling that it seeks to, if anything, restrain Western policy. Now, I think that it's right to focus in the first instance on doing everything possible to make it ever more difficult for Russia to fight this war. A Putin regime that cannot win this war, yet incurs steadily growing costs in waging it in futile and exhausting ways, is a regime that will steadily become weaker. So you cannot distinguish the fate of the regime from the fate of the larger country. And in my second piece, my Moscow Times article, I drew attention to the fact that the Soviet dissident tradition seemed to understand this much more clearly. So if you look at the sorts of things that these brave people, for all of the differences between them, whether they're in internal exile or forced out of the country, Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, Sharansky, Ginsburg, others, they were all very clear, and they called on Western governments to increase their constraints, to increase sanctions, to depart from the détente-driven trade policies that Ostpolitik had promoted in the 1970s. They were clear that in order to weaken, undermine, constrain the regime, You have to constrain state power. They are indistinguishable from one another. And I think one of the differences between the Russian opposition today and their Soviet forebears in the past, in the Cold War times, is that the Russian opposition, they see themselves as, or they hope, they aspire to be future leaders back in the country. Whereas the Soviet dissidents saw themselves in a larger way as a moral conscience. Their purpose was to set out clear, morally impeccable, and uncompromising positions. Now, you might say, well, the politicians are the realist, the moralists are sort of lofty and impractical, and they stake out grand positions, but they don't really work. I think the opposite is the case. I think that many times in history, and the late Soviet period is a case in point, those who were clearest and most uncompromising in their moral visions and moral positions turned out to be the greatest realists. It was their position that was ultimately vindicated by the course of events. Now, I don't know what view today's opposition politicians take of the Sakharovs and the Solzhenitsyns and so on. It will be very interesting to ask them, and if this debate continues, I hope that they might respond to that.
I've not heard an awful lot said about them, and I have watched many thousands of hours of information in Russian from various opposition sources. I think that's an absolutely fascinating point. I'm going to push you further on one point here because I think there's something incredibly important hiding beneath this. You talked about many of the opposition, including Yashin and Karamazov, and especially the Navalny team, seeking to protect the people from the costs of the war. And here we're talking about sanctions materially not affecting their individual lives. We could come back to Ukraine, the fact that Wilbur is very explicitly seeking to make people aware of those costs, make those costs painful for them. But I think there's something more disturbing behind this, and that is they're also seeking to absolve the Russian population from any sense of responsibility. If you don't want them to bear the financial cost, you essentially absolve them from any moral cost as well. And it is perhaps, I would put forward the argument here, it's the actual absolution that Putin granted the Russian people from the sense of their historical crimes, and that's explicitly what his regime has done, that has led to the current war. So is this not, well, first of all, I'd like see if you agree that this is a dangerous subtext behind what's being said. But is it not also, essentially something that could prepare the ground for the next war and the next, if the Russian people are once again shielded from the effects of the criminal regime that they live under?
Mm, mm. This is an interesting and I think so quite complex piece of terrain. Uh, I'm not one of those. I know that there are people who take this view. I do not quite share it. There are some who say that Russians, ordinary Russians, bear some collective responsibility for the war. I'm reluctant to say that because I'm not sure it's a test we apply to societies in other times and places when countries, when regimes, when leaders, when governments have done terrible things. I'm not sure that we very often say, well, the whole society is sort of responsible for that, especially if it's a highly autocratic system where ordinary people have little or no say in the way that decisions are taken. Secondly, I think that one of the really interesting features of this war is how uneasy, how quietly uneasy quite a large number of people are about it and have been from the start. And again, we could have a longer conversation about this, but we know that there were, in the first days before the crackdowns really began, soon after the full-scale invasion, there were demonstrations and public protests in a number of cities. We know there have been, brave individuals that have defied the ever increasing forms of repression, and they've been sentenced to, extraordinary prison terms as a consequence. I think also if you look at such polling data as is still available in Russia, I think it points in interesting and sort of ambiguous ways. On the one hand, if you ask like a boilerplate question, like, do you support the war? Do you support Putin? Large numbers of people, large majority knows that the safe thing to say is yes, you support this, and yes, we support the war. But if the question asked is more in the nature of, uh, do you support a ceasefire, which is not the Kremlin's position, let's be clear about that. Putin's repeatedly rejected a ceasefire. A growing proportion, a majority now, is saying yes, they do support a ceasefire. And I think even the Kremlin recognizes implicitly that this is a war for which there is, relatively little genuine mass enthusiasm. And that's why, this is a subject of an earlier conversation we had, that's why the Kremlin has resorted to this exceptional, historically very unusual way of recruiting large numbers of people to die on the front. It's not forcibly mobilizing them, did that just for a month in September 2022, and that was very unpopular. What it's done is pay them ever rising sums of money to do so. And yes, some people have done that. They've taken the Tsar's ruble, so to speak, and gone. But the point is, they wouldn't have done that unless they'd been extremely well paid to do so. Now, there's more to say about all of this, but my view is that again, we should be very careful about saying, Russia as such or most Russians are complicit. Uh, and it's precisely for that reason, actually, that I think that the Russian opposition should be bolder in its moral messaging, because there is something to work with here. Leadership, even in opposition, is all about vision and all about setting out a clear way of thinking about the most important issues of the day. And none is more important than the war and its consequences. So, since there is this quiet unease that's reluctant to articulate itself too explicitly, but that unease is clearly there, that's precisely, I think, the space, the opportunity for the Russian opposition to set out clear markers, a clear framing of another different Russia, not just, a Russia without the Putin regime, but what does that mean? And what does a full and proper end to the war? What does a long-term future for Russia in the international system, in global society, which departs decisively from imperial traditions? What does that look like?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because we did hold the German population largely collectively responsible for the acts of the Nazis. And indeed, there was moments where local populations next to concentration camps were forcibly taken around them to see what was happening in their communities and on their doorsteps. Um, I'm a little more bullish here in that I think one of the failings, and when I was in Russia in the 90s, there was amongst the intelligentsia a process of examining the crimes of the past, the Stalinist crimes, that had only just come to light. I think one of the features of Putin's regime was that he said, you don't need to worry about that stuff anymore.
Mm,
I
mm,
can enable you to feel good about yourselves, and you no longer have to feel guilty for anything. We will
mm,
absolve you of all of that. Um, we won't get into Masha and the bear, but there is this idea also that Putin also told his people that you will have impunity to feel great, to commit crimes, to be complicit in crimes, and not have to bear the responsibility for them. I think it's a defining feature of the war. If the opposition ever get near the reins of power, but are not prepared to tackle these thorny issues, but rather say to the population, well, do you know what? We didn't do any of this, nor did you. It was all this guy Putin. It was all him. Don't worry about it.
mm,
Which many of them have hinted at. Many of them, I think, would default to doing that. It's very, very convenient. We see Melnichenko and others pretty
mm,
much setting the ground for everything to be dumped on the shoulders of Putin.
mm,
This unfortunately does not bode well for the future, surely.
mm, mm, mm. I take your point, and uh, yes, it would. any system of sufficient brutality and violence needs a lot of enablers, and it needs even more, you know, to look away and not see what's happening. And what was the famous line when from one of the Russian poets? Who was it? Who said, when the gulags were finally opened up after Stalin's death, uh, and you had this sort of mass release of prisoners, and uh, the um, the prison, the gulag kind of authorities and so on were kind of dissolved. There's a line about the two Russias sort of standing face to face or eyeing one another, uh, the oppressed and the oppressors. And so Solzhenitsyn has an even more interesting twist on that. He talks about the line of also good and evil running through each person, not just between people. So yes, these to some extent these become, as it were, philosophical questions. Uh, and I suspect we're not far from each other in our ultimate position. It's a matter of kind of a spectrum. I mean, just to caricature it a little, maybe on one end you can imagine a hypothetical position that you know all or almost all Russians are kind of culpable or guilty or responsible, and on the other, only those who are part of the regime in some official capacity are culpable and should be sanctioned and so on. I suspect most of us would have some sort of position somewhere in between. But just to bring this down to earth and relate it to one particular proposal that some Russian opposition figures have made, and we've touched on it already, it would make me uneasy to say to people who have, large numbers of people who have lived and worked, quite happily, chosen to stay in Russia uh, for over 4 years of this war, may even have in some ways supported the war machine, done worked in it in some capacity, say, okay, you can come to Europe now. I think that would be a very very problematic indeed for moral reasons as well as for counterintelligence reasons.
And of course, people will, I think, rightly point out that all this is well and good, especially my more extreme position of the need to re-educate the Russian public. They would say there's a practical problem here. We are not going to occupy Russia. We are not going to rebuild its system from the ground up. We are not going to transform its education system and make this idea of culpability and historical re-education a core part of re-architecting new society, as we did with Germany. Interestingly, we didn't really do that with Austria. Rather, they painted themselves as victims and absented themselves from that process, which is that's a whole other can of worms there. But we're not going to occupy Russia. There's no scenario in which either the West or Ukraine does that in order to implement, a clean slate, as it were.
That's right, and that's a directly relevant point as well to another position that we hear some of the opposition exiled leaders are saying, which is there's a preoccupation in persuading. And I was when I did some research for these pieces, I was surprised how much it came up. I was genuinely surprised. Repeatedly there are figures that say we must get Western governments to prepare for a Marshall Plan and not a Morgenthau Plan. Now, what did they mean by that? The Marshall Plan, of course, announced in 1947, implemented from 1948, large-scale financial aid to reconstruct Western Europe, including, of course, West Germany, which had been the greater part of the old Germany that had carried out these terrible crimes during the Second World War. The Morgenthau Plan had been proposed by the then US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau in 1944, before the war was over, but you're already thinking about post-war planning. The Morgenthau Plan essentially said deindustrialize Germany. How do you manage the German problem? You take away its industrial capacity. Extraordinary, radical step to take. That was ultimately rejected. The better way, as it were, of managing the German problem for a while was not to industrialize it; it was to split it up. and absorb, integrate the greater, more prosperous part of it into Western security structures. So you have this discourse out there. We mustn't let them impose the Morgenthau Plan. Well, no one is proposing that. No one's contemplating occupying Russia. We must get a Marshall Plan. Really? We're going to provide billions of dollars to Russia? I don't seem plausible at all. But the extra twist, going back to your point, Jonathan, is that, of course, the Marshall Plan was only politically possible, and specifically, it was only politically possible to provide large sums of money to West Germany because West Germany had been defeated, had accepted unconditional surrender, had been occupied and split up. Those were the necessary preconditions politically that allowed us to, and America, I should say, it was an extraordinary act of generosity, to begin the process of rebuilding West Germany. So, of course, no one talks about that. And again, this strikes me as such an utterly unrealistic proposal. And why aren't they talking about Ukraine's future and the way that Ukraine can be integrated into Western security structures to ensure that Russia never aggresses again? So if you think about Russia's future, it's much more about how you can help us Russia become prosperous again, not how you can help constrain Russia and prevent it doing this again.
This is a fascinating one because that really ties into the next question I had, which is that they're asking for these vast resources, which, frankly, in the state of the world as it is now, and what's called the democratic deficit of capacity to act, that those funds simply do not exist in the way they used to, and the will to use them is sort of less there as well. But also, many of these oppositionists would say, we want your money and resources, but we will not accept any interference. We will not accept being told how to do anything whatsoever. And even more troubling, for me at least, in what I've observed over these 4+ years of doing the podcast, is that very few in the so-called Russian opposition reference the Ukrainian example. The only country that has managed to defeat a Moscow-imposed, dare I say it, tyrant, Yanukovych, and make a start on rooting out many of the methodologies of corruption and nepotism with which Russia uses to coerce and control. The only country that's really achieved this is Ukraine, and yet they seem to be singularly refusing to learn any lessons from Ukraine, thinking they're exceptional and they're going to go their own way. This strikes me as extraordinarily unrealistic and somewhat dangerous.
And you can sort of understand why most Ukrainians are pretty skeptical of and not especially trusting of the Russian opposition. A Russian opposition, properly so called, it seems to me, would be aligned much more closely with Ukraine and its defensive war. Ukraine wishes no ill against Russia. It merely wishes to successfully defend its own sovereignty and culture. And it's not clear to me why that isn't supported more fully and explicitly. Rhetorically, it is, of course, and go back to this Berlin Declaration that I mentioned, 2023, many, but not all, significantly not all, major Russian figures signed it. It does talk about returning Russia to its internationally recognized borders. But look at the discrepancy, it seems to me, or the ambiguity, this contradiction I referred to at the beginning between words and deeds. It seems easier to sign a document with the right sounding words, but look at the concrete positions that they are taking and the policies that they're urging on the West. And you can sort of understand why the Ukrainians are a little suspicious of this. And finally, just to round this out, we've talked about a number of the positions that have been set out in this way that seem more preoccupied with protecting Russia's sort of position, its people and its assets, than with uh, ensuring Russia's failure in this war. One more, and it's a subject I've taken a close sort of personal interest in. It's the question of what happens to those frozen Russian central bank assets that were immobilized in Western banking systems at the beginning of the invasion, and which not much has been done with since. Some of it has been used as collateral to provide a loan to Ukraine, but the obvious morally and strategically correct thing to do, wholly defensible under international law, let's be clear about that, is to transfer that money, the aggressor's money, and provide it to Ukraine. That's what we're talking about, around $300 billion. That would be an absolute game changer. That's twice Ukraine's national income. Made clear to Russia it will never get that money back. Uh, the Russian opposition should be urging that. On the contrary, they oppose it. And again, I refer once more to this inconsistency, this failure of strategic clarity, which I, I hope will be addressed.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've talked about this. I think it's a while since I talked about this one, but I compare it to the Russian opposition, showing up to a gunfight with a spoon. There's something really quite inadequate. They're using or modeling themselves very much on liberal sort of political methodologies in peacetime in a democracy in order to actually tackle one of the most vicious and entrenched regimes in history. It's almost like they're using, I'll call it vegetarian methods to tackle a fully carnivorous regime. But is there another subtext here in that some of them are dependent on, as you say, their audience, who is ethnic Russian, and the appetite for extremism amongst the diaspora is, I think, fairly low. But also they know that there are certain elements in the West who would not approve of more extreme methods. And I refer here to someone who I spoke to in the Belarusian opposition who said they were explicitly told by, in this instance, the US, that their protests against Lukashenko would be supported only insofar as they adopted entirely peaceful means doomed to fail, and they were explicitly told not to do what those Ukrainians did on the Maidan.
Well, the Ukrainians on Maidan, that was a peaceful protest, of course. The violence was initiated by the Yanukovych regime. I mean, there are limits to what any exiled opposition anywhere can do. They're out of the country. Uh, by definition, they have no sort of direct access to Russian society, although it's easier than ever in our connected world, despite the growing restrictions on the internet, on VPNs, and so on. Uh, I come back to this point about exercising leadership and moral clarity in messages. Now, the likes of Solzhenitsyn and Ginsburg and so on, and Sakharov, they were considered very, very unwelcome to the Soviet regime, precisely because they were sort of in their different ways moral giants. And they set out a clear and uncompromising uh, sense idea of what Russia might be and what was needed, including by Western policy, to help hasten that. And those positions are very different from the ones today. So we have right now, it seems the ARs are, I mean, most of their time and effort is devoted to sort of lobbying the West. And lobbying the West, as we've discussed, in some respects, to restrain its policies, which is pretty extraordinary, rather than sort of setting out, trying to speak to, however, difficult it might be, to keep that kind of moral flame in respect to of Russia's possible future, alive and burning for those in Russia who are willing to listen to it.
And it brings the suggestion here that actually, if they're not willing to, let's say, bring that clarity, maybe they don't have the political clarity about what they foresee coming after the sort of society that they see post-Putin, which leads me to a sneaking suspicion that they may not want to fundamentally change it, rather to become a part of it.
Well, it's a very, very good question. And I mean, some have set out in general terms what they certainly some of the principles that they think should guide the future design of a Russian state. Khodorkovsky is very keen on adopting a parliamentary rather than presidential system. But I agree, fundamentally, we need, again, leadership is about vision. Uh, and I think it would be really important to set out in some greater detail what that might look like, both domestically but also internationally. This is really, really important. So, because, let us hope the day comes when this terrible invasion fails. Uh, Perhaps there is some regime change, collapse, or evolution. And supposing a different and more moderate group of people, whether from this present opposition or elsewhere, from within Russia perhaps, some combination of them, were to take office, take power, they would then appeal to the West to lift sanctions, to reconcile, to improve relations. Who knows what that would look like? But I think that's, if a post-Putin regime comes, that's one plausible scenario. One entirely understandable response from the West would be, I'm sorry, we've seen this before. Look what happened in the early 90s, early, mid, late 90s. It's another reason why the demands for a Marshall Plan need to be sort of elaborated, to say the least, because the West actually gave and lent a lot of money to Russia in to stabilize the country during those tumultuous years of transition in the 1990s. And ultimately, that laid the foundation for a regime to take root that in due course, just 20 or so years later, would mount a new and much more dangerous challenge to European and international security. So the opposition has to persuade us all that if they or some other post-Putin leadership were to run Russia, they wouldn't just, as it were, revert to historical type in due course and break this malign historical pattern.
Did you expect that you would be poking a hornet's nest, dare I say it, with this article? I expect you didn't, but what's been your experience? I mean, to sort of top the episode out, what's been your experience? What has been the kind of debates? You don't have to give any particular names, but what has the pushback been that you've received through comments or maybe even directly?
It's a very good question, and the responses surprised me. There was one direct published reply in the Moscow Times from Ilya Yashin. That's fine. Happy with that. I have to continue the debate, and I responded to that too. But in other fora, on X and elsewhere, it has been made known to me that some people have reacted very sharply. I think what particularly surprises me, in some cases at least, has been the tone of it. I welcome constructive disagreement. That's fine. That's the fruit of good debate and argument. But there's been a kind of, in some cases, I would say, a brittleness or a prickliness to the responses. Perhaps a better way to put that would be a defensiveness. It's not just we disagree for the following reasons, but it's sort of being angry and quite upset about this. And I don't quite understand why, because if I mean, my criticism was very moderate. Again, I wasn't impugning anyone's motives. I was above all trying to draw attention to the lack of strategic clarity. And if someone disagrees, then they can just say, no, I disagree. I think you're wrong for the following reasons. But it got a bit more personal than that, shall we say, in a few cases. And I'm not sure that's really called for or really helps debate. Maybe it, maybe the strength of that reaction uh, tells us something. I'm not sure quite what it tells us, but I'll be interested to see how this debate continues.
Well, I think if we look at the historical, let's say, dare I say it, factionalism and friction that is a defining feature of Moscow opposition life, Russian opposition life, going back into the 20th century as well, in the 19th, then maybe these divisions and acrimony perhaps have something of a historical context there, and you've just entered that sort of circle of vituperative, sort of confrontational. I wouldn't even call it dialogue in some instances, but I think it's an essential set of questions that you've raised. They're really important articles. We'll put links to them, of course, in the description of the video. I think Western naivety towards the Russian opposition is extremely dangerous. So actually bringing these debates out into the open is incredibly welcome. Nigel, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure.